developed using these techniques promise significant gains in accuracy. That is, predictive systems promise significant gains in accuracy over more traditional statistical tools. However, as is, I think, well known at this point, the mathematical models that these systems rely on are thought to be black boxes. The inner workings are mysterious, even to experts. Whereas more traditional predictive systems, by contrast, are said to rely on predictive models that are interpretable. So these are simple enough to be readily understood by humans, at least humans with the requisite expertise. Okay, so the difference between those traditional systems and current machine learning systems is thought to be both epistemically and morally significant. On the epistemic side, concerns generally begin with the observation that the relevant models, the new machine learning models, are often, if not always, a bad guide to understanding causal phenomena. That's notwithstanding some interesting work that's going on in causal modeling with ML. And on the moral side, critics worry that black box systems, especially those used in high stakes applications, so think of things like medical decision making, lending, hiring contexts. The concern is that these can be unsafe, discriminatory, difficult to evaluate from a moral and legal perspective, and perhaps even incompatible with legal and moral demands to provide explanations to decision subjects. And some authors go so far as to suggest that black box systems just shouldn't be used at all, at least not if an interpretable alternative is available, even at the cost of sacrificing predictive accuracy. So we're going to focus in a little bit here on what we call the problem of algorithmic opacity. So let me say a little bit about that. The thought here is that making good decisions often requires making accurate predictions about the likely outcome of alternative courses of action. And in many cases, decision makers could improve the accuracy of their predictions dramatically by relying on black box machine learning systems. But the increased predictive accuracy comes at the cost of decreased transparency. Again, the reason that these things are called black boxes is that there's at least some sense in which even experts don't understand how they arrive at the predictions they make. And since these systems are increasingly being used in contexts in which it matters to us how and why a decision is being made, the fact that the way that they arrive at their decisions is largely inaccessible to us is a moral concern. Or at any rate, the opacity of black box systems seems like a major concern. So while criticism about the use of black box machine learning to make high stakes decisions is widespread in both public discourse and the academic literatures of several disciplines, more skeptical voices point out that these criticisms have yet to be given solid normative, conceptual, and technical foundations. So the skeptical authors identify at least 3 challenges that critics of black box decision making have yet to meet, at least by their lights. So first, some critics contend that the concept of interpretability remains poorly understood. And so launching a criticism against the use of black box machine learning systems on the grounds that they're interpretable is simply not on good footing. So we can't spell out the objections in fully robust, rigorous ways unless we have a clear understanding of what interpretability is supposed to be in the first place. And we don't have that, so we should be skeptical that the problem of algorithmic opacity is a genuine problem. Second, the double standard concern here is that the problem of algorithmic opacity treats machine systems, holds them to a standard that we don't hold non-machine standards to. So the concern here is that the arguments against the use of these systems are typically going to overgeneralize. They would rule out using, in some cases, even human decision making, and that seems like a problem for for the objections. And then lastly, some skeptics argue that although the problem can be well articulated, and although it might correctly narrowly target automated systems rather than human systems, it's just not that interesting. So this is our final box here in which we say the response is just that, yeah, there's a problem here, but it's really easy to solve. And this response comes in two varieties, at least that we can detect. One of which is a technical response that says, yeah, look, you're right that a lot of existing models have these problematic features, but there's a technical solution. So we'll just implement these standards or processes to transform previously uninterpretable systems into interpretable systems, and now we're done. The second variety of this form of skepticism is moral in nature, and it says, yeah, okay, right, there's a genuine moral concern here. That is, there are moral reasons not to make use of the systems of this sort in the relevant kinds of context, but those reasons are just massively outweighed by countervailing reasons. So there's a kind of problem here, but it's not especially interesting because the competing reasons are so weighty. So what we want to try to do is make a little bit of sense of what's going on in the literature, and also take some initial steps toward answering the skeptical challenges. And so we think of those two things as going hand in hand. That is, answering the skeptical challenge and laying a foundation for further persistifying and understanding what the problem of algorithmic opacity is supposed to be in the first place. Because we think that skeptical responses to the problem sound appealing, in part because complaints about the use of automated decision-making have typically been narrowly understood as being primarily about transparency. And in our view, the literature has mistakenly focused on this narrow range of duties, what we're calling duties of transparency, conformity with which requires us to disclose information of some kind or other to decision subjects. So I'm under a duty of transparency when I am required to provide information to you of some kind. And the skeptical challenge gets its grip, we think, in part because of this narrow focus. It could really well be that black box algorithms can be created that satisfy demands of transparency, or satisfy them at least as well as alternative decision-making systems that we take to be morally legitimate. But it's just not true that all that we owe to decision subjects is fully captured by duties of transparency. We're also bound by what we're calling duties of consideration. These are duties that require us to be appropriately responsive to the morally relevant features of decision subjects and decision makers' relations to them. So we're going to most of what we're going to do today is try to unpack that idea. But before we get into it, just briefly make a case that duties of consideration are at least as important as duties of transparency, if not more important. I think we're probably all inclined to say the stronger thing, although we're not sort of really committed to it here. And that's for a few reasons. The first is that we just won't be able to reliably treat people fairly if we're not sensitive to their morally relevant similarities and differences. And secondly, one reason that transparency is valuable is that it helps decision makers to satisfy duties of consideration. So at least sometimes we want to say that duties of transparency are derivative from duties of consideration. So by facilitating oversight, transparency helps reveal ways in which the decision procedure in question fails to be appropriately sensitive to decision subjects' morally relevant features, or succeeds. Right? You might want to ensure that things are going well in the good cases. And lastly, duties of consideration plausibly apply in a broader range of decision-making contexts than duties of transparency. So for example, it seems plausible that small businesses, so not giant employers, but small businesses, aren't morally obligated to be fully transparent about how they make hiring decisions. So we don't want to demand, that the mom and pop corner shop can't withhold at least some information about how they're thinking about candidates. But they are morally obligated to hire in a way that's appropriately sensitive to the strengths and weaknesses of individual applicants. They're not, sort of morally permitted to do whatever they want with respect to their hiring decision, even if they don't have to be fully transparent about it. Okay, so what's going to happen in the remainder of the talk is that we're going to try to make good on the two goals that I outlined just a moment ago. By saying more about how we understand the structure and content of duties of consideration. And that's going to put us in a position to show the implications that these duties have for understanding the problem of algorithmic opacity, and put us in a position to argue that skeptical responses to it miss the mark. Okay, so we're going to do that by saying a little bit more about duties of consideration generally. That's what I'm going to do on the next slide. And then we're going to look more closely at at two variations of duties of consideration that we call duties of evidential consideration and duties of moral consideration. So one more slide for me, and then I'm going to hand things over to David. Okay, so being appropriately responsive to the morally relevant features of decision subjects, the folks about whom you're making decisions, requires both effective theoretical reasoning and effective moral reasoning. The moral reasoning is required to determine which features of subjects are directly relevant to how they ought to be treated. Right? So we have some decision to make. We have this class of people over whom we're making the decision, and we want to know, in what ways do the similarities and dissimilarities across these individuals matter morally. And then we also have to do some moral reasoning to think about how what ought to be done in light of those features depends on their on those features taken in combination. And effective theoretical reasoning is required to determine which features decision subjects actually possess and how they differ in the ways moral reasoning indicates are directly relevant. Okay, so we want to say that a decision procedure can fail to show due consideration, the sort of responsiveness to morally relevant features that satisfies all applicable duties of consideration, by failing at either the theoretical reasoning task or the moral reasoning task. Okay. So with that in mind, we can distinguish two duties of consideration: duties that concern its theoretical reasoning component and those that concern its moral reasoning component. Duties of evidential consideration require decision makers to take reasonable steps to form accurate beliefs about decision subjects' morally relevant features by being appropriately responsive to the available evidence about those features. And duties of moral consideration require decision makers to take reasonable steps to fully understand the implications of those features for how the decision subjects ought to be treated, and then to act accordingly. Okay. So part of what we're after here is making the case that the use of automated black box decision systems could interfere with discharging both of those duties. Okay. So systems of the relevant kind consists of a piece of software that implements a mathematical model that takes as input available data about the individual. So in the lending case, think, for example, about like line items in their credit report, and outputs a numerical score representing the system's prediction about the feature of interest. So in this case, the the likelihood that they'll default on the loan under consideration. So in some cases, the system's prediction directly determines how the individual will be treated. We could have a decision-making process set up so that I just automate this predictive task, and then so long as you like clear some threshold for the likelihood of repaying the loan, you get the loan, and if you don't clear it, then you don't get the loan. The role of the system, as just described, is epistemic. Right? The system is used to help decision makers form beliefs about features of decision subjects that are taken to be directly morally relevant by either informing or supplanting their own assessments of the available evidence. And so while the role of the systems, as we understand it, is epistemic, we're nevertheless going to argue that relying on the systems can interfere both with duties of due evidential and due moral consideration. Okay, so I'm going to hand things over to David, who's going to talk more about evidential consideration. Then he'll kick it back to me when we turn to a closer look at moral consideration. David?
Okay. So as Jeff mentioned, duties of evidential consideration require decision makers to form beliefs about decision subjects' morally relevant features in ways that are appropriately sensitive to the available evidence. So by doing some moral reasoning, decision makers come to a conclusion about which features make a difference to how decision subjects ought to be treated. But theoretical reasoning is required to determine the extent to which particular decision subjects actually possess those features. So, for example, suppose you're a criminal judge and you're responsible for deciding whether to grant bail to the defendants that appear before you in court. And suppose you believe that the likelihood that a defendant will commit a crime if released is morally relevant to whether they ought to be granted bail. You still need to decide how you're going to predict how likely it is that each individual defendant is going to commit a crime. And it's clear that not just any method for making those predictions is going to be consistent with treating defendants fairly. So, for example, just looking at the defendant and going with your gut presumably would be unfair. And what we're calling duties of evidential consideration are the moral duties that determine how you ought to go about forming your beliefs about what decision subjects are like in terms of their morally relevant features. Slide. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to identify 3 different ways in which relying on a black box system might interfere with decision makers' ability to discharge their duties of evidential consideration. So first, accuracy. So contrary to popular belief, black box machine learning systems are sometimes less accurate than other available predictive methods. Second, ignoring available evidence. Black box machine learning systems have a tendency, when compared with human decision makers, to ignore evidence that they haven't specifically been designed to take into account. And sometimes that evidence is highly irrelevant to how decision subjects ought to be treated. And third, morally inadmissible evidence. Black box machine learning systems can, unbeknownst to their designers, rely on evidence that decision makers have a moral obligation to set aside. So I'm going to start with accuracy slide. So actually back up one, Jeff. All right. So I said earlier that it would be unfair for a judge to assess the risk that a defendant will commit a crime by looking at the defendant and following their gut instincts. And at least one reason it seems like that would be unfair is that it's presumably not a very accurate way to predict the future behavior of defendants. And the more general point here is that decision makers quite generally have an obligation to form beliefs about what morally relevant features decision subjects have using reliably accurate methods. Now, you might think that black box machine learning systems are going to have a clear advantage here over other predictive methods, because after all, the standard line on black box machine learning is that these systems are capable of making more accurate predictions than is possible using more traditional techniques. And that's sort of regardless of how we choose to measure accuracy. However, while black box machine learning systems often make more accurate predictions than other systems, that's not always true. So as the computer scientist Cynthia Rudin and others have argued, often interpretable methods perform just as well or almost as well. And moreover, relying on a black box machine learning system that seems to perform well in testing conditions can actually lead you to make less accurate predictions in practice. So I'm going to give an example of how this happens. So in the 90s slide, there was a large multi-institutional research study that developed a variety of predictive models that were all trying to predict patients' risk of dying from pneumonia. So they used a variety of different model types, including both neural nets and simpler, more interpretable tools. And unsurprisingly, the neural networks, which are a kind of black box model, performed significantly better than the interpretable models. But the researchers nonetheless decided to recommend that those neural nets not be used in hospital settings. So why would that be if they made more accurate predictions in the lab? Well, when the researchers inspected one of the more interpretable models, they found that it was classifying patients with asthma as at lower risk of dying from pneumonia than patients without asthma. That's surprising, given that asthma is actually a risk factor for pneumonia mortality. So what was going on? So it turns out that in hospital settings, it's actually true that patients with asthma are at lower risk of dying from pneumonia. But that's because medical staff accurately predict that they're more likely to die of pneumonia than other patients, and so they treat them more aggressively. So a predictive rule that implements the inference rule on the slide would make the right prediction, but for the wrong reasons in a typical hospital setting. So relying on such a model could easily lead to a disaster, as the model would misclassify patients with asthma as low risk of dying from pneumonia without intensive medical intervention. So why did this is an example about an interpretable model. So why did this lead researchers to abandon using the neural nets, which are a kind of black box model? So the reason is that in virtue of being black box models, the researchers didn't really understand why the neural nets were making the specific predictions they make, or why they were successful. So a neural net that performed exceptionally well at predicting pneumonia on sample data might be doing that by implementing a problematic predictive rule like the one on this slide. And since the model is a black box, there just wouldn't be an effective way necessarily for researchers to spot the mistake. So one way in which relying on a black box machine learning model might lead decision makers to respond inappropriately to their available evidence is that it might lead them to form less accurate conclusions about what features decision subjects have than they might otherwise. Okay, so slide. So the next duty that I'm going to talk about is the duty not to ignore readily available evidence. So the aforementioned claim that actuarial predictive systems tend to outperform human decision makers is a claim about averages. So actuarial systems, including black box systems, tend to make fewer errors on average than human decision makers. But actuarial methods can be completely insensitive to highly relevant evidence that a human decision maker would be unlikely to miss, resulting in sort of far less reliable predictions for certain kinds of cases. So for example, COMPASS is an actuarial tool, though not a black box tool, that predicts the likelihood that a person will commit a crime in the next 2 years. And judges across the US use COMPASS to make decisions about pretrial bail. They're provided with the defendant's COMPASS score and are instructed to grant or deny bail based on whether they believe the defendant poses a significant risk to the public. So assume for the sake of argument that COMPASS scores represent a more accurate prediction of defendants' likelihood to recidivate on average than judges would make if they were simply to review the defendant's file and rely on their own judgment. It might nonetheless be the case that in particular cases, judges are in a much better position to review the evidence that's available. So here's an example of how that might happen. So suppose that a judge is deciding whether to grant bail to a defendant with a lengthy criminal record. And given the defendant's criminal past, they naturally get a very high COMPASS score. However, the judge has a piece of evidence that COMPASS isn't designed to take into account, which is testimony from the defendant's neurologist. Slide. So according to the defendant's highly respected neurologist, the defendant's past criminal behavior was the result of a brain tumor that's since been successfully removed. And it's the professional opinion of the neurologist that the defendant's unlikely to commit any crimes in the future now that the physical problem has been corrected. So we can stipulate that the details of the situation are such that the judge ought to believe the neurologist, and so that they ought to believe that the defendant's at a very low risk of committing a crime if released. But since COMPASS isn't designed to take the neurologist's testimonial evidence into account, it mistakenly labels the defendant as high risk, which is, again, a mistake that a human decision maker wouldn't be likely to make. So what's the point? So what the hypothetical example is supposed to show is that the duty of evidential consideration requires more than making accurate predictions on average. It requires further that they be appropriately sensitive to the totality of the evidence that's available to them. And a decision procedure that fails to respond to evidence that's both readily available and highly relevant is ipso facto unfair to decision subjects who would otherwise benefit from that evidence being considered. So the point of the compass example is a point about actuarial systems in general, systems that make predictions using statistical techniques. Compass isn't actually a black box system, as you may know. However, the general issue for actuarial systems I've just identified is, I think, particularly problematic in the case of black box systems. So one common complaint about black box systems is that decision makers tend to be unable to integrate the scores that these systems produce with other available evidence that the scores don't take into account. And since decision makers are not in a position to know what features of decision subjects are being exploited by the system to make predictions, or more generally, how the system is disposed to respond to particular pieces of evidence, they aren't in a position to know when the system's predictions are likely to be unreliable and how to adjust them based on other evidence that they happen to have. By contrast, when an interpretable method is used, decision makers are in a much better position to be appropriately sensitive to the total evidence that bears on each individual's case. That's at least if they have the requisite expertise to understand how the interpretable methods work. Okay, slide. The third duty of evidential consideration that I'm going to talk about is the duty to set aside morally inadmissible evidence. So slide again. So a piece of evidence is morally inadmissible in the sense that we have in mind just in case the decision maker is morally obligated to set that evidence aside for purposes of making the decision that they're making. So consider cases of so-called rational discrimination. So these are cases in which an employer prefers not to hire members of a marginalized social group because they believe that they're likely to perform less well on the job than others due to structural discrimination, structural disadvantages. So in these cases, an applicant's social group membership is taken to be evidence that they have some other feature, which is poor future job performance, that is less controversially relevant to whether they ought to be hired. So even if we assume that the employer is right about the relationship between group membership and job performance, it seems very unfair for her to take this evidence into account in making hiring decisions. That seems like a kind of discrimination, wrongful discrimination. So instead, the employer is morally obligated to set facts about social group membership aside, at least in typical cases, and decide whom to hire as if she did not have this piece of otherwise relevant evidence. So that's just an example of morally inadmissible evidence, and the term comes from a David Enoch paper about paternalism. So what does this have to do with black box machine learning? So in contexts in which some evidence is morally inadmissible, decision makers have an obligation to take reasonable steps to avoid relying on it. And reliance on black box machine learning has the potential to interfere with this obligation for a few reasons. So first, the data sets that are used to train the kinds of black box systems that we're discussing often contain information about individuals that would be a morally problematic basis for decision making, such as information about social group membership. Second, machine learning systems just have no compunction about relying on these kinds of features, and so will readily exploit them if doing so will enable more accurate predictions. And third, it's by definition difficult to determine what features a black box machine learning system is exploiting to make predictions, which can make it difficult for decision makers to determine whether morally inadmissible evidence is being used by the system. So here's a famous example that you may have heard of. So in 2017, Amazon was forced to mothball a very expensive machine learning system that its recruiters had been using to evaluate candidates after discovering that it had learned to downgrade candidates who attended women's colleges or played on women's sports teams. So they trained the system on past hiring data, which reflected the biases of Amazon's past hiring managers against women candidates. And they didn't actually discover this problem until well into development and after the system had already been provided to recruiters as they were making hiring decisions. Although there's sort of some controversy about how exactly it was used, I should say. Something very similar incidentally happened with an AI-based resume evaluating system that was produced by a different company, which is that it gave very high ratings to applicants who were named Jared and played lacrosse in high school, like this example. So these are both examples of evidence types that seem morally impermissible because they unfairly disadvantage members of certain social groups. But it's worth noting that evidence might be morally inadmissible on other grounds. So one example that I think is particularly relevant here is private information. So you might think that basing lending decisions on applicants' web browsing data violates their privacy rights and so is morally inadmissible on that basis. So there are other kinds of examples of this kind of evidence as well. All right, I'm just going to briefly recap and then hand it back to Jeff. So I've identified 3 ways in which reliance on black box machine learning might lead decision makers to be inappropriately responsive to the available evidence. First, by leading them to make less accurate predictions than they would otherwise make. Second, by leading them to ignore highly relevant evidence that's also readily available. And third, by leading them to rely on morally inadmissible evidence, which again is evidence that they're obligated to set aside for purposes of decision making. All right, Jeff is up.
Okay, sorry, I'm back, but the slides are not advancing here. Here we go. Okay, sorry. Thanks, David. All right, so as David says, beyond the duties that decision makers have to responsibly learn about someone's morally relevant features, they are also under a duty to responsibly handle or engage with those features. So this is going to lead us to articulating I think what in our minds is a quite broad category of duties that we'll call duties of moral consideration. And in the remainder of the talk, we're going to primarily draw attention to what we think is one significant kind of duty of moral consideration, and that falls well outside the scope of duties of transparency, and we're going to call these duties of agential consideration. So a duty of agential consideration is a duty that a decision maker exercise their agency, understood broadly to include their deliberative and empathic capacities when exercising authority or decision-making powers over a decision subject. So to tee this up a little bit, part of what we're going to be interested in here is not only whether decision makers are sort of responsibly interacting with evidence in the way that David just described, but whether in implementing some decision-making process, they are responsibly relating themselves to those that they're exercising decision-making power over. Okay, so to motivate the existence of such duties, let's consider a thought experiment. So we'll go science fiction here in this section of the talk. So imagine that computer scientists create juror models for any individual eligible to serve on a jury. The models are trained on personalized data sets and are able to predict with perfect accuracy how a given juror would find in any given criminal case. After years of testing, the court system adopts the juror model substitution policy. So jurors are still called for jury duty using the same processes that are in use today. They come to court, lawyers are given a chance to evaluate and dismiss jurors as usual, fill in the details for any particular instance of your favorite morally acceptable form of jury selection. But once jurors are selected, the juror can opt to leave the case, and the juror model will be used to adjudicate instead. And so, again, this is pretty science fiction-y, but you can imagine the models are taking in like all range of inputs that a human juror would, so visual, auditory, etc. And we can imagine that when the judge tells the juror model to disregard some piece of information, the model does that in just the same, just in a way that approximates how the juror would do it, or maybe even exceeds that. But in any case, what's crucial here is that we stipulate that we're as confident as we could be that the model will reach all of the same decisions that its counterpart human would reach. So we can tell you that there's something morally problematic about the use of juror models, something that isn't captured by duties of transparency or duties of evidential consideration. Instead, part of what's morally problematic with the use of such models is that we, the fellow citizens of those on trial, owe it to them to deliberate about them from a particular perspective. Decision subjects in criminal trials, those who are on trial, are owed deliberation by a jury of their peers, a jury that to some degree can empathize with the decision subject and deliberate about the particulars of the case and the circumstances of the decision subject and other parties in ways that we take it algorithmic decision-making systems are incapable of doing. So the thought here is that it seems like part of what legitimates the trial by jury method is that members of one's moral community have in fact attended to their evidence. They're attending to it in the ways that the trial requires is part of what legitimates the outcome. Okay, so this isn't to say, of course, that jury trials don't involve duties of evidential consideration or duties of transparency. Remember, and since we're, I guess, a little while removed from this, remember that duties of transparency are duties of decision makers to provide information to the decision subjects. And I'll return briefly to this in a few moments. Okay, so zooming out here for a minute, duties of agential consideration aren't exhaustive of duties of moral consideration, but we think even on their own they go some way toward responding to the skeptics of the problem of algorithmic opacity. So first, notice that where decision makers owe a duty of agential consideration, that duty will provide at least a pro tanto reason to avoid the use of opaque algorithmic systems, or provide guidance for incorporating such a system into a complex decision-making process. So where such systems would supplant decision makers with agential capacities, that is where they would supplant them, decision-making will fail to satisfy duties of agential consideration. So this is like the juror substitution case. And where such systems merely serve to supplement decision-making, whether or not duties of agential consideration are met will depend in part on whether the ways in which they supplement human decision-making detracts from human decision-makers' appropriate exercise of agency in the context. And it could be that in cases of that kind, the opacity makes it difficult to know whether they have exercised their agency appropriately. And that last point extends further. So even if you thought that AI systems could themselves discharge duties of agential consideration, the use of black box systems would still make it difficult to know whether it's happened. While we don't know for sure that it happens in human systems, we have ready heuristics. Right? We can assess other people's stated reasons. We can interpret their behavior and so on. So the important duties of agential considerations, the import of duties of agential consideration seems to be significant, even if we think it's in principle possible for machine systems to discharge them. But we don't mean to say that duties of agential consideration provide decisive reason against deploying algorithmic decision-making systems, and not even decisive reason against deploying entirely opaque ones. So returning to the juror model example, there may be scenarios in which the advantages offered by juror substitution outweigh the failure to meet duties of consideration. So, I mean, we could think together about what that might look like. But the thought here is, you could imagine scenarios in which we think it's especially morally significant to continue treating evidence in the way that that trials by jury treat evidence. But there's like some very significant risk to actually requiring that we seat human jurors. Again, I mean, we're going to be in the land of thought experiments here, but we can think of a range of scenarios in which we just stipulate that it's especially risky in some way. So even then, though, broadening our attention in the way that we're calling for here, that is broadening our attention to the full range of duties that we owe to decision subjects, we think pays off. So skeptics of the problem of algorithmic opacity claim that there's a double standard, or at least some of them claim that there's a double standard when we call for levels of transparency that we don't require in human decision-making systems. But whether there's a double standard depends on the full range of normative considerations at play in each context. So suppose that we do go in for juror substitution. It seems like we'd be applying a double standard and demanding an explanation for how the models operated, right? So it's not like, you're on trial and John and David and I are jurors along with our fellows, and then we return, say, an innocent verdict. It's not like at that point we insist that John, David, and I and our fellows accurately report the inner workings of our thought processes. Certainly we don't demand like the like the physical realizers of those processes. And so, if you were to implement the jury model and then to demand some level of transparency beyond what we demand from humans, it may appear that you're insisting on a double standard. But the thought here is maybe not. There might not be a double standard, although you're demanding different things. So when we substitute models for humans, it could just be that the normative reasons shift. So returning to an earlier thought, suppose that we imagine a case in which there's some risk to not to human jurors participating in a trial by jury, but there's risk to them disclosing the details of their decision-making processes, right? So like if David tells you in full detail how he arrived at returning the guilty verdict, then maybe he'll be at risk of harm from I don't know, some accomplice of the defendant. Or imagine it's something less interesting than that. It would just be like way too bureaucratically costly on the judicial system to insist that jurors provide this in every case, and so that those reasons like swamp the demand to be transparent. So that's a case in which the reasons stand but are outweighed, and in a possible version of juror substitution, where we're going to use our sci-fi models, those reasons just won't apply. So there's no fear of retribution against the model, or maybe the model is designed in such a way that there's no bureaucratic cost to providing explanations. And so the upshot here, I mean, the important thing here is that whether it's reasonable to demand a level of transparency from automated systems that's different from that that we demand from human system is going to depend on on the full normative context. And once you have that in view, you might uncover that in fact there's no standard, there's no double standard. It's a single standard that applies differently once the normative landscape shifts through the introduction of an automated decision making system. Okay, final slide. It makes sense that people are concerned about the use of black box systems in high stakes decision-making situations. And it's tempting to think that that's primarily because of their opacity. After all, right, that's supposed to be one of the major things that distinguishes traditional predictive systems from black box decision-making systems. And our view is that temptation to treat the opacity as the primary explanation of what's problematic about the use of these systems. That temptation, we think, has driven most of the discussion to the point that it's at now, where we're fixated on whether black box systems are sufficiently transparent, or whether they could be made so, or whether we can use them and then provide to decision subjects the right kind of information, even if they can't be made fully transparent in some sort of technical sense of the term. So the way that I think about this, I mean, the way that we think about this is that that sort of mode of reasoning kind of starts with this hypothesis about what's causing the trouble, its opacity or the lack of transparency, and you start there, and then you sort of reason outward. You do your theorizing with an anchoring point, and then try to identify problems and potential solutions to them with that idea taking pride of place. And we think that's just it's an unhelpful way to begin making sense of the dialectical space that we're operating here. So we owe more to decision subjects than information. And sometimes we owe them information because we owe them something else. So when we're considering whether we should deploy black box decision-making systems in some context, we shouldn't start by asking whether the model is too opaque. We should start by asking how this context demands that we treat the people that we're making decisions about. And answering that question will help us know what we're permitted to do with respect to automating any part of that decision-making process. Thank you. That's it for us.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, I mean, thanks to Mario, we also had